Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the TBA for the invitation to come and speak to you today on what has to be by far and away the most interesting topic. Hey? Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay, so I'm glad I got the morning, because after lunch it does tend to put everybody to sleep talking about worms, but just to say we've got half an hour to get through what is a relatively big topic. Hopefully you know most of it already. We're just going to touch on the worms that we're most interested in on the stud farm in particular. We're then going to look at the wormers that are available on the market. And that's just as a bit of a background. What I really want to get into is the assessment and management of worms in our breeding stock. So how do we work out the level of infestation of worms in our horses? How, given the concerns that we'll come on to about resistance to the drugs that we've got, how do we monitor the drug effectiveness? And what can we do to limit the amount of drugs that we're going to be using in our population of horses? So, did anybody read this article in the Owner Breeder on antibiotic resistance? Congratulations. Neither did I. No, I did. It was entirely on antibiotics, of course, but let's just extrapolate it to the worms. We have a growing problem in the human world and the veterinary world for antibiotic resistance. We all know that, yes? The same thing occurs with worms. We have, for years, underestimated the worm. We've, for years, underestimated the bacteria. So we have thrown drugs at them, antibiotics, wormers, all sorts of things to hold them in their place. But you can't beat nature, and it will always come round and bite you. And we have relied upon drug companies and those in ivory towers to look after us. And there is coming a time that we've got to really reassess how we approach to bacterial infection and to worm infestation. So, there is hope, surprisingly, and we'll go through a little bit of that hope later in the day. But I just want to start at the very start and remind you of the things that you already know. These are the classes of drugs we have available. There's 4 of them. The bottom one, praziquantel, is tapeworm specific. So we are relying for the vast majority of our worm control on these 3 classes. There's the fenbendazole, there's the ivermectin, the moxidectin group, and there's the pyrantel group. The long names doesn't mean anything. The trade names are what you probably know as well. They're Panacure, they're the Ecvalans, the Vectins, and then the Strongid Ps. There is resistance reported to all these classes of drugs in the worm population. Some of this resistance has made the worm as we're using almost ineffective, or in some cases totally ineffective. So we've got to strategically use these wormers at the right time, and a little bit of understanding how we've got to this point might be useful. We've always known horses have worms. We've always known that high infestations of worms can cause clinical disease. And about 40 years ago, there was the introduction of pretty good commercial wormers, and that had a dramatic and sustained fall in worm-associated disease. And we thought the battle was won. New drugs came into the market, and there was a recommendation from the drug companies and from everybody involved in the industry that we started to give our drugs at certain times of the year, basically every 6 to 8 weeks. Sometimes in the case of Equest and moxidectin, we might push that to 12 weeks, but there was every 6 to 8 to 12 weeks a tube of wormer that was given to every single horse on the farm. And that's called the interval dose plan. It was an interval treatment throughout the year. Now that has lost favour, and there are better ways of doing it. But if you look on the internet, you will still find some recommendations from drug companies, from people who have a vested interest to have this repeated interval dosing continued. And unfortunately, this interval dosing, repeated treatment, has led the worm population to develop resistant genes, and for us, through the repeated use of these wormers, to select our worm population to have reasonably convincing resistance to the drugs that we're using. But we all are involved in studs, and we know that they're a special place. And they're special because of the awkwardness of them. We have a very wide range of animals. We have sick neonatal foals, we have newborn foals, we have slightly older foals, we have yearlings, we have adults, we have resting mares, we have horses that come in for the season, get covered, go home. We've got horses that are only there for a short period of time. We have pressure on our studs because of grass space. We have overgrazed paddocks. We have the fear of wormers, so we tend to be worried, and so we will often rely on wormers and use them as just-in-case treatments. We have a lot of pressure on us as stud farm vets and stud farm owners, and it's perfectly understandable that we find ourselves with our backs against the wall and just trying to stand still, keeping running but standing still. However, and a lot of you are probably doing this now, if we take a step back and look at the problems that we might have on the farm by the use of worm egg counts, which are worm egg counts, you'll see that a lot in this talk, through the weighing of horses prior to treatment and giving those wormers that we're going to use at the right time, at the right dose, and having an understanding of worming, which hopefully we'll go some way towards doing that this morning, we'll be in a much better place to take this stud farm problem and step forwards into the next few years. And I think it's excellent, I'll just mention this at this moment, if you're going to be getting a weighing scale to monitor your young stock growing up, then you can use it for your wormers. I try and convince people to buy weigh scales to treat horses appropriately for the dose, and I struggle. So actually there's a buy one, get one free option today. So we'll go through some worms, and here they are. We've got the threadworms, we've got the large ascarid worms, which are these big spaghetti worms. We've got the cyathostomes, the small red worms, the tapeworm, and a little pinworm there, Oxyuris. You'll see these a lot if you have horses. But the main three that we're going to discuss in horses are these, the ascarid, the cyathostomes, and the tapeworm. And the ones we're going to particularly pay attention to today because of time are the ascarids and the cyathostomes. The ascarids, these big long spaghetti worms, are a main problem in the foal, in the young animal, and the cyathostomes more of a problem in the older yearling and into the adult. So we'll start with cyathostomes. As I say, these are considered to be the most significant parasite in the adult. Lots of them around. But the most important thing about them, and we'll just pick out a couple of important points, is this bit. These worms have a life cycle that allows them to overwinter, hibernate, in the colon wall inside the horse. L is a larvae, the third stage larva, enters the colon wall, develops into a little encysted form where it hangs about for a while until it comes out, typically late winter, early spring, just in time for that growing season. And this is the damage that it causes to the colon. They all come out at the same time and they can cause quite serious damage. And I just point out every one of these pictures you see will have a number at the bottom. PPP means pre-patent period. How long it takes for you, or the horse preferably, to eat a larvae and for that larvae to grow into an adult and start producing eggs. So in the case of cyathostomes, it's about 6 weeks, but it might be up to 2 years. Just gives you an idea in your mind when you're managing worms how long this life cycle is. Okay, so this is what the problem is with cyathostomes and the diseases that they can cause. We've got sorry, a gruesome picture early in the morning, but this is a horse which has had a large eruption of these hibernatory larvae. They all come out, and if you look closely, you can see the little red worms there. They cause a massive damage to this colon. Now, this is really severe, but the milder cases cause colic, diarrhea, poor weight gain, or even weight loss, quite profound weight loss. So you end up with youngsters that look like this. It's not something that you want. But the problem is hidden. You don't know it's there until it suddenly erupts and causes the issue. And our other problem is resistance. There is widespread resistance to some of our go-to drugs. So pyrantel and fenbendazole has significant resistance. Some resistance also to your ivermectins and occasionally to the moxidectin. Those are all our drugs we've got. So these worms have got potentially considered to be the upper hand at the moment. The large Strongyles, these are worms that have been around for a very long time, and we'll just gloss over those because we're just a bit tight on time. But the important thing about these large Strongyles is that their life cycle incorporates a hanging around in large blood vessels inside the horse. When they then get bigger and bigger, they can cause a rupture of those blood vessels that can lead to pretty unpleasant clinical disease. These are generally speaking under control with the wormers that we've been using over the years, so we don't tend to see much disease associated with it. But back of your mind is, if worms are becoming more resistant, these might come back on the page and start having to be addressed specifically. The tapeworm, and again, it's an increasing problem, but one that we don't often see. You're quite unlucky if you see a tapeworm floating around in the droppings of horses. But they can cause quite significant clinical disease. And the reason for that is, the reason for that is that their place where they live inside the horse is at the junction of the small intestine to the large intestine, the ileocecal junction. They can cause a blockage there, can cause really quite nasty colic, again, weight loss, and telescoping in of the small intestine upon itself. This is a horse at surgery. You can actually see the worms that are responsible for this outbreak of colic. Detecting the tapeworm is a bit of a challenge. As you're probably aware, there's a blood test and there is a saliva test that's on the market at the moment, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. It really is something that we have to detect by lab tests and then interpret those lab tests for which wormers that which treatment that we'll then give the horse. Studs do a lot of worming, do a lot of foaling. Our first worm that a foal is going to be exposed to is this one. It's the Strongyloides westeri, the threadworm. And it has a fascinating little step. It goes down the milk into the mare, from the mare into the foal. So it's the first worm that that foal will encounter. Look at the pre-patent period on this one, 8 to 14 days. If you're a January foal, it might be chilly and you might not grow very well, but you won't see many worms. If you're a June foal, how many 8s and 14s are into 6 months? Loads. So there's a lot of worms that can suddenly grow up. And so your foals that are born in April, May and June have the risk of meeting a great deal more of these worms than your ones in January and February, which means that we have a lot of environmental contamination to contend with. Again, we'll come to that right at the very end. Okay, now we're on to the meaty worms, the Ascarids. Now these are mainly found in the young animals, and thankfully there is some immunity that develops, generally speaking, about 6 months going forwards, so that all the horses by about 18 months are going to be fully immune. There'll be a small number that aren't, but the majority will be. So it really is a disease of the young animal. The adults churn out eggs like it's going out of fashion, thousands and thousands a day, and they're very sticky and resistant eggs. They shed them onto the paddock. so they can persist in the environment for a very, very long time. This is a little bit of their life cycle, and this is the important part. These larvae are swallowed, they go down into the intestine, they come out through the intestinal wall, through the liver, through the diaphragm, up through the lung, all the way to the top of the trachea, pop out, get swallowed again, and then develop into the adult. It's sort of a waste of time going round twice, but the important thing is it goes through a lot of organs, your liver and your lungs. In a small number, it's not a problem, but if you do get a large infestation, you can start to get some clinical disease associated with it. Not just the colics, not just the usual ill thrift, but you can start get respiratory disease and coughing. And if you get a very, very heavy infestation of these Ascarids, they can cause a blockage in the intestine, which can cause these horses to have a surgical lesion. They go for surgery, and it's not a good surgery to do, not associated with a great outcome. Those intestines often are pretty compromised. So that's one bad point. The second bad point is Ascarids have an irritating resistance to some of our go-to drugs, namely ivermectin. Now, the ivermectin resistance is pretty widespread. Pyrantel, Strongid P, and fenbendazole, Panacur seem to be still effective, but we've lost one of our main drugs in ivermectin. Little mention of the pinworm. These are the ones that lay the eggs around the anus. You may have seen them. They're very, very itchy and can cause issues in that regard. Something that we thought we had on the run, but I don't know about you. I'm certainly seeing more studs associated with problems with pinworm. And that, again, just highlights that some of these worms are coming back into play. Lungworms, not often mentioned. It's more of a problem if you run orphan foals with donkeys and that type of thing. And I merely mentioned bots as one interesting thing. This is a part of a life cycle of a fly, but all the bots from this gastrophilus fly live in the stomach of a horse over winter. So if you want to be strategic and spot on about treating them, you would know that every single bot is inside a horse's stomach in the winter. And if you so decided, you could speak to everybody in the country and you could treat all those horses on the same day in the winter, and you would annihilate that. That means catching every little pony running around the New Forest, everything on the moors. But if you understand the life cycle of a worm or a fly or whatever it might be, you can target it specifically, and you can get a lot further in managing these worms if you understand their life cycles. So hopefully we've taken a step 2 there at the moment. Now, this is a study that was published a few years back, but you may have been involved in it. It looked at a questionnaire through lots of studs in the UK, and there's just a few little interesting stats that I wanted to mention. About 3/4 of thoroughbred studs accept visiting mares. Of that, just over half of them would co-graze the resident mares with their visiting mares. They put them into the same field together. But only 3/4 of the respondents to this survey gave a wormer prior to doing that. So there's 25% of horses that didn't. Of those horses that were given a wormer, half were given ivermectin and half were given moxidectin. And if you remember back to our start, ivermectin and moxidectin are from the same family of drugs. So we are majoring with 3/4 of horses being given moxidectin on their arrival to a stud. That's a lot of reliance on one drug. Now, we're all here today to talk to each other, and I think that's most important. Nearly 90% of studs had a parasite control program, but only 1/4 of them spoke to their vets about it. We need to be much more proactive as vets talking to the industry, and we all need to talk to each other because we've all got stuff that we can throw into the pot. And I think we should do that more often. I think it's really good to discuss things ahead of the ground. We've got time in the winter sometimes to chat about the next season. We do rely far too much as an industry on some drugs, namely the ivermectin and the moxidectin. That's 50% of all the drugs that we would use would be that type, which is a lot. And finally, there was a general appreciation from this study that all wormers were less effective in this year than they had been previously. Sorry about the crackle. And that indicates that there's a problem brewing. But one last statistic that I think is important to remember, and that is that 20% of your horses will have 80% of the worms. If you have 10 horses, 2 of them will be harbouring the majority of the worms. If you have 100 horses, that's 20. If you have 1,000 horses, that's 200. If you can identify those 20% of the horses that are harbouring 80% of the worms, it's a really good start to go forwards to how you're going to manage the effective approach that we really have to have to worm control. And that is a 5-point approach. Number 1 is we need to find which drugs are effective on the premises. We've spoken about resistance. I'd be no help to you at all if we didn't discuss how we can find out which drugs are going to be more useful. Number 2, we need to be using the right drug at the right time at the right dose. Number 3, we need to identify where those 20% of those horses are. Which are the 20% of the high shedders? Because they seem to be repeat offenders, time and time and time again. We need, and this is most important now, to assess the response to the treatment. If you have a high infestation, you give a drug, you need to know that it's come down to 0. You need to know the horse has responded to it. Because if it hasn't, that indicates that there's a resistance problem. If you take a worm egg count and the drug should last for 8 weeks, and you take a worm egg count at 6 weeks and the eggs are coming back, that indicates that there's a developing problem. So by being proactive with our testing, we can understand whether there's full resistance, partial resistance, or no resistance at all. And that could be a really important place to start. And number 5 is what can we do with the environmental contamination? What can we do that doesn't involve drugs? So it's really a strategic approach, a targeted approach to worming. And it basically is only treat those horses that need it. If you can identify those 20% of the horses that excrete 80% of the eggs, that's a great place to start. Use worm egg counts. Use worm egg count reduction tests. So that is basically another worm egg count 2 weeks after you have done a worming to make sure that that horse that had a high infestation has come down to 0. That's a lot of data, that's a lot of testing, and trying to keep hold of it is quite difficult. So you've got to have a system for managing all this information. If you, just one example is the smart worming website run by Meriel. Just allows you to put everything in and keep a handle on it. It doesn't matter how you do it, you just need to have some database that you that allows you to keep on top of it. And this word here, Refugia, this is absolutely integral to the approach to managing the worms in the current age. And do you know about Refugia? Some do, some don't. But Refugia is a jazzy word basically where worms have a refuge. It's a proportion of a population that is not exposed to a particular drug. So let's talk about it in worms. Worms that are not exposed to the wormer that you put down the horse's mouth are 3. They are the larvae on the ground in the pasture, they are the untreated animals that you can't catch, or they are the inhibited stages or the larvae that are migrating through that horse but are not in adult form that they can be killed by the drug you're giving. Is that right? If they are not going to be exposed to the drug, they can't become resistant to the drug because they've never met it. And if we incorporate this Refugia into our approach, it really has a logically a good argument. Now, this is my attempt at trying to explain Refugia. If you already understand it, take 5 seconds to snooze. But this is how I think of it. We have 2 horses here. We have 2 horses here. Sorry. Thanks. Oh, I've gone the wrong way. It's so good you have to look at it twice. Okay, we have 2 horses here. The black worms are worms that will be killed by the worm we're about to give. The redworm is a worm that is not going to be killed. It's a resistant worm. So the black worms are good worms, if you like, and the red worms are bad worms. So we give each of these horses a wormer. This is like giving everything on the farm a wormer. And out of these horses, these are the living worms that come out. They're your resistant worms. They're your bad worms, because all the black ones are dead. So we have lots of them. And they go onto the pasture. They breed with each other. They get stronger. I'm not meaning to scare. It sounds like it's a horrible sort of film, doesn't it? But we're basically getting lots and lots of these resistant worms onto the paddock. And the fear is that in the future, all the horses that go onto that paddock and eat those eggs are going to be infested with the resistant worm, and we know that the drugs we're going to give them doesn't work. So, it's horrible. But don't worry. This is just an example. Okay, so this is a refugia. This is what to do with strategic worming. We have 2 horses again. This horse on the left has got a high infestation of worms. The one on the right has got a tolerable, we'll talk about that in a minute, tolerable infestation of worms. We give a wormer to this one because it's got more than anybody else. We don't give anything to the other one. And so what comes out is our resistant worm from this horse on the left, but then we get all the worms coming out of the right horse, which are resistant and sensitive worms. So we have a mixture. And the nice thing about worms is that they breed together, and the resistant worms are being diluted out by the sensitive worms, which means that when, in years to come, we give a wormer back to the horses that need it, we're going to kill the majority of the worms that are in the population. That's what Refugia is, strategically giving drugs to horses, but keeping a proportion of sensitive ones in the background. Okay. Now, we've just got 10 minutes left to talk about the certain critical age groups that we're all concerned about. And, of course, young foals are number 1, aren't they? They're a tricky lot, because until those worms have been ingested and grown to adults and producing eggs, we can't test their droppings for eggs, because there's no adults to make the eggs. And that is the big problem. We're not going to get any useful worm egg count data out of these until they're 8 to 10 to 12 weeks old. But I know, and we know, don't we, that these foals are at risk of Ascarids, those big spaghetti worms. They're also at risk with the little Strongyles worm that goes down the milk. One study showed that 40% of foals in this age group are infested with Ascarids. That's a lot, and we can't risk that as an industry. We can't leave these foals unprotected. But from everything that I've said, you'd be tempted to say, well, we've got to wait until we can prove it. But we know that 40% of horses of this age are going to be exposed. And it is a general consensus that because they are going to be exposed and because of the risk of clinical disease, we really do have to, in these circumstances, treat them with the appropriate drug at the appropriate time. Now, I questioned whether to move this group to the end because it sounds like we're just going back to our old way of treating them. But if we work through this whole different age group, we'll find that actually things don't just happen in an instant, they take some time to work through. And it's all about a concerted, systematic approach to controlling the worms, which will then in the future have a beneficial effect for this group here. But as I say, the treatment is not always obvious. Should we be using ivermectin that we know has got some resistance? Should we be using some of the other ones that are available, like the pyrantals? Should we be using a wormer that kills the larvae? Well, the only ones that do that are ones that either aren't licensed in foals or ones that require 5-day treatments. Do you want to catch a 8-week-old foal and give it a wormer for 5 days? Not really. I don't think it's the greatest idea. So I think it's an idea of looking at your whole population and making the right decision at the right time for you. And I'm not going to give you a plan right now where to go. I think it's something that actually has to be bespoke for each stud individually. We all know that the moxidectin, the Equest that's our usual go-to, is not licensed for use in foals that are less than 4 months, just as a little aside. These foals are a little bit older, and they could and they should have worm egg counts taken from them at about 10 to 12 weeks. And that gives us an idea of what sort of worms we're dealing with. And any positives that come through, I'm pretty tough on. I don't like these foals at this age to have many worms, because our worm egg count, although very, very useful, doesn't give you all that information about how many worms they've got. But it's as good a test as we've got at the moment. Hopefully things will change in the future. So this group of foals, when you get your worm egg counts back on them, I'm pretty tough on their positives, and I do like to treat them effectively. And I repeat the worm egg counts every 6 to 8 weeks. Now I know taking worm egg counts is not everyone's idea of fun, but it's not that difficult if you get it into a system, and it has to work, because I appreciate that it's a big ask for management. But anyway, I do treat these foals, and then I always worm egg count reduction test them again 2 weeks later to prove that we're down to 0. These foals get older, they get to weaning, they have other problems as well. The Lawsonia, the Rhodococcus. If you have a worm burden on board, you're going to be more at risk of getting other clinical disease. So sorting out the worms is a really good way of reducing the incidence of disease in these older foals. I like to give tapeworm after weaning in that autumn, October time, and I do like to give a encysted form treatment of the Cyathostomes in December. That's the amoxidectin. And the reason for that is, in the first 2 to 3 months, our main worm that we're worried about is going to be the Ascarids, the big spaghetti worms. As you get to about 6 months, the Ascarids and the Strongyles start to become of equal concern. Most of these animals will develop an immunity to the Ascarids, so thereafter, in the 9 to 12 months old, it's the Strongyles that are going to be more problematic. The Strongyles, the Cyathostomes, the ones that overwinter, which is why I like to use amoxidectin in the winter to sort those out. So knowing the worm, knowing the life cycle, allows you to target the species of worm that you need to nail appropriately. We've got the yearlings as they get that little bit older, and I like to worm egg count those every 8 weeks. It gives you lots of data, gives you lots of idea, and it allows you to pick up those small number of animals that have Ascarids still that are going to act as a reservoir and shed them. I talk about worm egg counts. What's a tolerable level? Well, everyone has their own, somewhere between 200 and 400 eggs per gram. That's how we measure it. Somewhere around the 350 eggs per gram is a tolerable level. You might want to be harder and go for 200. You might be softer, go for 4. But somewhere around that 3 to 350 eggs per gram, absolutely, because foals are animals with less than that are not going to have any clinical disease. Anything with more than that is going to be shedding it onto your pasture. So that's one way of differentiating them. We've talked a little earlier about tapeworm, the blood test and the saliva test. Both have pros, both have cons, but I think the exciting thing is the equine saliva test for tapeworm. If it does, as it is proving suggested to, can really help target treat the animals that actually do have tapeworms, rather than us just treating it because we think it's got it. And it's not much to say about the adults. I like to worm egg count those every 8 to 12 weeks. Tapeworm them once a year, and then a moxidectin perhaps in the winter time, certainly in the first year or two of doing this. And then as you get more and more data, you can start to ease back on that winter treatment if you think it's appropriate. I know plenty of studs, that maybe 15, 20, 30 mares, who can get down to worming 2 or 3 of these adults once or twice a year, which is a massive improvement on worming every single one of them 4 times a year. Just got 3 slides left. The new arrivals, what to do about them. Now, I know that if you have horses coming in to stay at studs, it's really difficult with co-grazing them. So what should we give them? We certainly don't want to introduce worms. We don't want to introduce any resistant worms. So if we're going to give them something, we want to give them something that is absolutely going to nail all the worms. And the only one that will do that at the moment for the Cyathostomes and the Ascarids is something like moxidectin. But if we rely on that too much, we'll find that it's going to become less useful for us in the future. But it's a risk assessment. Have a discussion on the stud, decide what the risk is, decide whether we ought to be taking worm egg counts before we treat, decide whether you should be keeping horses separate for biosecurity measures, decide whether you treat them in a field, leave them for 2 weeks before introducing them to something. It's something up for discussion. Decide what your risk factor is. And then we have to talk about the environment. Now, the eggs and the larvae accumulate over years in the paddocks, and it's likely, because of the way that we've done things over the years, we've got lots and lots of worms in the ground. So we've got to get rid of them. Got to reduce stocking densities if at all possible. We have to pick up the droppings daily, ideally, but certainly twice a week. But I'd certainly major on your foal and your nursery paddocks because of this annoying build-up of worms during the stud season. So if you can do the smaller paddocks every day and the bigger ones twice a week, that's ideal. And it's time consuming. You need an army of people to do it. So some of the mechanical removal devices with Terravax absolutely make a massive difference. I'm sure a lot of you are involved with that anyway. Resting paddocks is extremely useful and beneficial if you can. And if you can do that during the heat of the summer, because we do occasionally get a warm day, and you can get the temperature over 20, 25, you'll find that the eggs that are in the paddock will start to hatch. And because they've got nowhere to go, if there are no horses in there, they will then die. But it does have to be hot, 20, 25 degrees Celsius, absolutely necessary if those eggs are going to hatch. And again, we mustn't dose and move, because if you dose a horse and move it immediately, the worms inside that intestine will take 3 to 4 days to die. They'll still be shedding eggs. If you leave them 10 days to 2 weeks, all those dead worms will be out and forgotten about, and you'll just be left with whatever's left in there, which is a risk, I know, about moving them to clean paddocks and pastures, which is why we need the other issues of picking up droppings to make sure that any worms that are still left in those horses, having moved them, are going to be removed from the paddocks. Topping of any roughs just takes away that little ecosystem inside these long tufts of grass, opens it up to air, opens it up to heat, and any of the worms that are still harbouring in that area are opened up to the environment. Sheep are excellent at hoovering up eggs. They're also pretty good for the paddocks as well. And because they eat an equine egg and the equine worm cannot develop into a sheep, it's a completely dead end, and that worm will be removed. So sheep are super. It's not so much a problem in the UK about using horse manure as fertiliser, but certainly on the continent it has been, and all it does is help the worms, spread them around the paddock. And don't forget the foaling boxes and the stables. If you have deep litter, that's an excellent place to harbour worms and an excellent place to have hatching of these worm eggs. It can be really, really strong populations of worms in the farm buildings, and that's something that we're starting to recognise now, and particularly those little threadworms that we mentioned earlier in the neonatal foal. So that is the whole talk on worms, which I hope has just been a bit of a review of the worms we've got. and how we might be able to use them beneficially and appropriately, because there aren't any other wormers in the market about to come out. We have what we've got. If we use them appropriately, we use them carefully, they'll be preserved for the future. But I think we should be relying on lab tests, we should be relying on these fecal worm egg count reduction tests to identify the horses that we need to treat. I think we should talk a lot more about it as well, and have a plan for the breeding of mares for next year, but also have a plan for the worm control. And at the end of the day, if you can reduce, you put into place some of these worm controls, you can reduce your usage of wormers by 75%. That's not a difficult thing to do. 75% of your wormers will not need to be used, and that has a massive financial saving per horse on an annual basis, which, if no better place to start from saving money, might be worth a go. Okay, thank you.